Welcome to Inspire Campfire, a podcast where ordinary people tell their stories of extraordinary adventure. These are campfire stories meant to inspire the rest of us to light the fire within, get outside, follow our dreams, and return to tell our own stories. Ready? Let's strike the match.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Scott Wurzbacher, and today we are voyaging into perseverance, adversity, and grit. Our guest is Stephan Kesting, adventurer, firefighter, jiu-jitsu practitioner, and now author of the newly released book, Perseverance, Life and Death in the Subarctic. I literally just finished reading it this morning, and it is so good. The book chronicles Stephan's 1,000-mile canoe voyage through the Canadian Subarctic, an expedition he took on after recovering from a life-threatening illness. It's a raw, gripping story of survival, resilience, and pushing past the limits of what we think is possible. I am so excited to have him here with us to share more about this nail-biting journey and the powerful lessons he learned along the way. Lessons that can help us all overcome the obstacles in our own lives. Stephan, welcome to the campfire.
Thank you so much, Scott. Really looking forward to this chat that we're about to have.
I'm so excited for people to be able to get this book just out. It's so good. Stephan, let's go right in. Beautiful, by the way. Beautiful cover, beautiful book design, and it's just such a great story. Tell us about this book. What is this book about?
Well, in about 2010, I found out that I was dying. I found out that I had polycystic kidney disease and that my kidneys were shutting down. It's a genetic condition. And I was under medical care and we were going along and we're doing all the blood work. And then one day, my nephrologist, my kidney doctor, said to me, "Hey, do you know anybody who can give you a kidney? Because we're getting close to that time." And all of a sudden, it really swum into focus. I'm dealing with this issue, but I'm still soldiering on. But all of a sudden it becomes very real when you have to go through your Rolodex and figure out who you're going to call to ask to give you a kidney. Because otherwise you just go on the kidney wait list, and that's a little bit longer. Now I've got a reasonably rare blood type, O negative. So I'm a universal donor, which speaks to the fact that I would 1,000 times rather give someone a kidney than ask someone for a kidney.
Yeah.
That's just how I'm wired. I don't want to be beholden to someone else, but this is one of the cases where you're bent over a barrel. And in the end, it was my brother who gave me a kidney. And in 2015, we went under the knife and I got wheeled into the operating room. And there in the operating room was this red nylon bag. And in that bag was my brother's kidney. It cut out of his body and was sitting on ice and then went into my body. It was a difficult surgery and recovery. There's lots of complications. I mean, it's a pretty major replumbing of the body. And you just never know. Well, first of all, you don't know if you're going to survive. Any surgery can go sideways. You have no control over that. You can control a couple of the variables coming in. Are you as healthy as you can be under the circumstances? Are you going to try and follow the doctor's directions? Are you going to try and do the rehab? Those are things in your control. But honestly, a lot of it's just a roll of the dice. And the other question is, how much function are you going to get back? I'm a very physical person between my job, which is firefighter, my passions, which are jiu-jitsu and the outdoors. Physical stuff is very central to my identity. And here I am, I've been diminished by this disease. I can still work out a little bit, but then I need to nap.
Yeah.
And now after the surgery, how much function will I regain? One of the last conscious thoughts I had before putting on the anesthesia mask, going under, was I wonder if I recover enough, can I finally do that trip I've been thinking about for 20 to 30 years?
Wow.
And so then it gave me, when I woke up and then went through all the various rehab and dealt with the infections and the complications and finally came out the other side, it was a good reminder that life is short. And not only is life short, the span in which you can do things where you have the energy, the strength, and the physicality to be able to achieve the things that you want to achieve, that's also a limited window. So then I started working towards that goal, which was exploring this part of the Canadian Subarctic. It begged the question of, what do I have to do in my life? What do I need to change in my life? What systems do I need to set up to enable me to bugger off for, I had 50 days carved out to bugger off for a 50-day trip. And so then a couple of years later, I headed off on what I thought would be a 50-day trip, going from the forests of northern Saskatchewan, the northern boreal forest, we're talking spruce trees, larch trees, and a few aspen, out onto the Arctic tundra that's on the west coast of Hudson Bay.
What a powerful introduction right there. I mean, there's a couple of things that I picked up on, and you haven't even told us really about the trip yet, except just maybe scratching the surface of where you were. First of all, this was the last thought that you had before you went under the anesthesia. How amazing. And then to be able to wake up and then be able to come back to that. So I definitely want to come back to that. And then the other thing that I heard you say, like, you just had this major operation as part of this illness. And rather than say, like, this is my life now, you asked the question, what do I have to do, or what do I have to change to enable myself to be able to? It wasn't, can I go on this trip? Yes or no. It was, what do I have to do to be able to go on this trip?
Well, there's certain things you can't control. Like, maybe I just never recover enough from this surgery to physically be able to paddle for 12, 13, 14 hours a day, to carry across heavy portages. Maybe that's not going to be possible. But, that's a roll of the dice. That is outside my control. Let's focus on what's in my control. And then as time went along, it became more apparent that at least I had a chance of finishing this journey. I mean, the truth is, when I set out, I gave myself about a 60% chance of being able to pull this off. I had some alternate bailout options, especially for the first half of the trip. I passed a series, 3 or 4 small native villages where I could have bailed out, right, if my body had just not been holding up. So it's this dichotomy between, I will do this, and at the same time, I need to consider, how do I bail out if things go wrong? I mean, going to Everest and saying, I will summit this bloody mountain. I had paid my $95,000 to my guide, and I don't care what the weather is. I'm climbing this damn mountain. That's great. If you succeed, then you can tell all your friends, I was determined to do it no matter what. But you've actually just lowered the odds of you surviving quite significantly. So you need this determination and perseverance. At the same time, you need to be thinking, you need to have a separate subroutine going, like, I just need to maintain some degree of assessing the feasibility of this, especially if, as I do, you have kids and you have family.
Yeah.
I can countenance taking greater risks. I'm either young and don't have kids, or old and they're all graduated, and they, if I'm 75 years old and I try and do this trip again, I'm not 75, but if when I'm 75, I try and do another trip like this and I bite it, I drown in a rapid, I get eaten by a bear, it's hard to call that a tragedy. I know it's bloody dangerous to do it at that age, but doing something like that when my kids are reasonably young, I do need to have a different risk assessment routine going on.
Yeah, it's a both and. I mean, it's this mindset of, I'm going to do this, but the realism that, I need to be able to pull back if that comes. I just really love that it was not a question of, can I or can't I, but like thinking differently and not asking a yes, no question, was more like, what would have to happen in order for me to. And then you set out on this journey. So you take this 1,000-mile, 40-day journey through the Canadian Subarctic. And by the way, again, amazing book. And the whole thing is chronicled in this book, so people can get all the details here. But could you kind of, for those that haven't read the book yet, it just came out. Can you kind of give us a little bit of a synopsis of this journey that you took?
Of course. So this region of Canada is on the Canadian Shield. So that would be, if you think of the terrain in, let me see if I can get the pronunciation right, Minnesota. If you think of that rolling, rocky countryside there, or Lake Superior country, if you've ever driven north of Lake Superior, Georgian Bay country, if you're from Canada. It's this granitic shield that rolls and undulates, and it's some of the oldest rock on the planet. It's billions of years old. And it's been ground down over many glaciations. And there's not very much soil. So there's an insane amount of water up there. Not necessarily accessible. It's be pretty hard to bring it south, but there's a ton of water up there, which also helps explain why there are billions of black flies and mosquitoes. The advantage of that terrain is that all that water and all these rivers that drain it, you can pretty much go start anywhere and end anywhere if you're willing to work hard enough. So I started in the boreal forest, a little tiny village of about 100 people. And I went down the Churchill River. The Churchill River is really important in the fur trade. It's basically a giant east-west artery. Hundreds of years ago, the voyageurs would trade with the native people who would catch, especially beaver, and then they'd pack it into their voyageur canoes and bring it down the Churchill and other rivers like that to the Great Lakes, and from there to Montreal, and from Montreal off to those stores of Europe. So I went down this historic artery. It was also an artery for the native people, obviously. Then I went off and went upriver on, well, if I go into all the rivers, then I went upriver, across a giant lake, up another river, over the height of land, down a river, across another giant lake, and then down another river, the Fluiaza, all the way down to Hudson Bay. There was upriver and downriver components. There's large lakes, which shouldn't be underestimated. I think that's probably one of the biggest dangers in the outdoors from a canoeing and kayaking perspective that gets underestimated, but kills way more people than you would think, especially when you're in a country where thunderstorms can come up in the matter of 20 minutes. In the end, it took 42 days. So I had 8 days of remaining food. I might have been able to stretch that a little bit longer if I'd been windbound, but I would have been even skinnier by the end. I think I lost about 15 or 20 pounds in those 42 days.
Yeah, that's crazy. So can you talk a little bit about the equipment that you had and,
Sure.
were you completely self-sustained for the entire 40 days? Were you able to restock along the way?
The answer is I was completely self-sustained. Now, when I went into a little native village, I would go into the store and buy some food. Just who doesn't want ice cream or brownies?
Right.
Just something different. And at that point, you're burning easily 5,000 calories a day. So you can eat anything you want. And it's not really a question of, is this healthy? Is this calorie dense enough to keep me going and to stem off some of that inevitable weight loss that's going to happen? While I did cheat and come out of these, at least 2 of those native villages with food, if the stores had been closed, I would have been able to keep going. So 50 days of food is quite a lot.
Yeah.
It works out to just over 200 pounds just in the food. In addition to that, I had clothing, I had repair kits, I had medical kits, cooking equipment. I took a Hilleberg tent. So those are tents from Scandinavia that are really pretty bomb-proof. I had a canoe kayak hybrid. It looks a little bit like a sea kayak with a top cut off, so it's a little bit easier to store gear in it. So that was my compromise. There is no one perfect boat. The boat that you want to be paddling in the middle of big whitewater is different from the boat that you want to be paddling in the middle of little technical whitewater.
Mm-hmm.
Is different from the boat you want to be paddling in big waves on the lake. This was my compromise. It was 17 foot, 6 inches long, pretty narrow. I could paddle it either with a canoe paddle, so that's one handle, one blade, or a kayak paddle, a long shaft with a blade at either end. I figured that alternating between those 2 paddling modalities would wear out different body parts. So if I ended up with tendinitis or some other repetitive strain injury, that I'd be able to at least try a different kind of paddle. It'd be like switching between cycling and running to get across the country. If you end up with some kind of horrible overuse injury from running, maybe you can cycle for a while.
Oh man. So obviously we're camping along the way. This is virtually a solo journey. You did interact with some people along the way. We'll talk about some of those stories. Like for me, reading the book was really fun. I think I might have shared with you the first time that you and I spoke before we started talking on the podcast, that this podcast was actually, you could say it was born in the boundary waters of Minnesota. So further south from where you were, but similar kind of country, right?
Hmm. Yeah, it's in the boreal forest.
Yeah.
The composition of the exact species will be a little bit different, but it
Yeah.
is that kind of. I mean, if you look at a map of the Boundary Waters or Quetico, it looks like an abstract painting. There's all these blue blotches of lakes, and it gets even crazier as you go further north. There's areas up there where, especially once you drag glaciers across that, you kind of carve grooves into the landscape. It looks like it's been clawed mostly in one direction by this giant animal. So hopefully your trip is taking you along the grooves and not perpendicular to the grooves, because then you've got a lot of those humps to cross. That can be a lot of work at times.
Yeah, it's so good though. It's like it just gives me. I felt like I was with you the whole time. Like the writing, you feel like you're right there with you, kind of experiencing what you were experiencing along the way. And having been up there, I mean, the black flies and the weather, and just the book itself is so full of adversity, and very clear why you call it perseverance, right? The book is absolutely about your perseverance. But I wonder if for listeners, if you could just maybe share some of the adversities, whether it was weather, wildlife, wildfires. I mean, the book has it all. Maybe would you share one or two stories with us?
I'll say one very difficult aspect of traveling the way I did cross country is traveling upriver. Traveling upriver, especially when the water is high, inevitably means you're going to get wet and be cold for a lot of the day. And you're operating in a pretty marginal environment. There are all kinds of different techniques for making your way up a river. Sometimes you can paddle up it. Sometimes you can stand in your boat and pull. That's the only modality I didn't use because my boat wasn't really well adapted. I would prefer to be in a different kind of canoe if I was poling upriver. There's tracking where you tie ropes to the front and back, angle the boat slightly out into the current. So when you walk up, there's sideways pressure pulling it out to the river. So that's an art. Now you're juggling the front rope and the back rope and trying not to break an ankle, but you got to splash through the water. So again, you get wet. The wading, there's inevitably lots of wading. So you're knee deep, hip deep, chest deep in water. And then dealing with the willows. Now, willows in the northern context are bushes. They're bushes that are they're actually range from less than an inch high to 2 or 3 yards high.
Okay.
9-10 feet high, depending where you are. And they have these long, spindly branches, and they love to grow at the side of rivers. So now you're trying to walk up the side of the river that falls off very deeply to the deep current, very sharply to the deep current. And there's all these bloody branches in your way, always with the willows. Struggling against those day after day, just being cold and wet and traveling so slowly. That's really, I think, where a lot of the perseverance was required.
Hey everyone, it's Scott here. Did you know that the members of my real estate team, W Realty Group, are listening to their own voices that call to adventure by setting big goals? Some of those goals include planning trips to Bali and the Kingdom of Bhutan, buying investment homes, and running the Chicago Marathon. At W Realty Group, we support and encourage these big goals and want to help turn them into reality. We're currently looking to add new members to the team. If you know a great real estate agent in the Charlotte, North Carolina area that would benefit from being part of our team, please send a text, an email, or give me a call. And know that when you support W Realty Group, you're also supporting this podcast. Thanks for listening.
One of the most funny in retrospect, but incredibly dangerous in the moment episodes was, so I was traveling up and there's this massive and beautiful and very unique lake that lies at the transition between the forest and the tundra. It's about 100 miles long. The southern part of it is in the trees and the northern part is out on the tundra. As you paddle up through it, you go through that ecotone, through that transition. And it's a fascinating process to watch and to travel through. Right at that transition point, there's a lodge. It's an old fishing lodge, and I knew it was somewhere on the lake, but I'd never managed to find the location. I'd tried to email them, I'd tried to phone them, just to have some contact there. Again, to create another bailout point if things had gone wrong, or possibly to fly supplies into if I really needed them. But they never got back to me, and it turned out it had gone bankrupt. So when I finally stumbled upon this, it's this beautiful lodge, this giant building on a ridge overlooking the lake. with a whole bunch of little cabins. And I paddled up to it, and it looked like it had been hit by a neutron bomb or the zombie apocalypse.
Wow.
Everything had just been abandoned where it was and left in place. So we're talking boat motors, we're talking workshops, buildings. As it turns out, they'd gone out of business in the middle of the season and they had to shut it down. There is somebody trying to rebuild this lodge system right now. And I'm not a fisherman very much. I'm not a hunter very much. But if you were one of those things, man, that lodge would be something to visit. So I just pull up there on the shore. There's a bunch of abandoned boats on the shore. The dock is kind of falling into the water. But, I just want to poke around a little bit. It's too early in the day to stop, but I'm just going to poke around. So I step out, start looking around, and I'm studying the ground because I don't want to stumble upon a bear. This is right in the zone where there could be black bear or tundra grizzly. When I say grizzly, brown bear, it's all grizzly, brown bear, Kodiaks. That's all one species of bear. I start wandering up through this complex, and there's a couple really old bear tracks, so nothing to worry about, nothing fresh. And I foolishly didn't bring my bear spray, and I didn't bring my 12 gauge. I'm just poking around. I'm just doing a quick look. And I go up to the main big lodge of the building, and I noticed that these things called bear boards have been moved. Bear board is like a piece of plywood with a whole bunch of nails stuck up through it. Typically fortify your cabin. You put these in front of your windows, your doors, so that if a bear tries to break in, it's going to step on the nails and not continue. And I noticed the bear board is pushed to the side, and I noticed that the front door has been kicked in. I'm like, oh man, the bears got in. And it turns out, yes, they did. Because then I immediately noticed that within the space of a couple of seconds, I noticed that the door had been kicked in. There was about 30 piles of bear turd within 10 feet of me, and that there was something growling at me from inside this lodge. So it's maybe a 4,000 square foot lodge overlooking the lake, and this bear has got it all to himself. It's one thing to come across a bear if you're on a trail and he's on a trail. Most of the time they run away. It's an entirely different thing to stumble upon a bear when it's in a den or when it's defending a kill. And now it's a territorial thing. So needless to say, I'm not at all happy about this. So I begin backing off, not running because I don't want to trigger a chase reflex. I start making my way back down to the boat. But that's a good 300-400 yards away. This is stupid. I should not have been there without some kind of bear deterrent. It's very much bear country. And as I go back, I go back a somewhat different route, a more direct route to my boat. And now there's just bear tracks everywhere. Like, I'm not a tracker, but they're super fresh. Like, it's where the claws have gone down into the sand. It looks like they've been carved by a razor blade. On either side. There's actual moisture at the bottom of the print. I mean, that bloody bear was out there in the last 20 minutes, and I missed all the sign. And it was a moment of, complacency. And fortunately, I got in the boat and I paddled away very quickly. And, this bear's got the absolute nicest lodge that any bear's ever had.
It's his place now.
Oh, yeah.
It's his. I can totally see, in the moment, how frightening that would be. But then looking back, it's one of my favorite stories from the book. The book is full of stories like that. But it was definitely one of my favorites.
If people want to read it, they can check out, they search my name and the word People Magazine. People Magazine took that story and did a little excerpt on it. So you can preview it for free if you want.
Cool. I'm not surprised. That's one of the fun stories in there.
I felt like an idiot because, to use martial arts terminology, I definitely have my black belt in outdoor activities. I have put in my 10,000 hours prior to that. And here I am making a rookie bloody mistake. It should not have happened, but it happened. And it's like, do I really admit to this? Like, well, yeah, I should, because it proves that instructive in the sense that, don't get complacent. You can screw up. There's a reason that pilots who've flown thousands of hours have a checklist. Am I taking off? And I'm not a pilot. I would imagine, check the left flap, check the right flap.
Yeah.
Do you have enough fuel? Double check that you have enough fuel. Does your radio work? They have a checklist because otherwise it's easy to forget stuff and it's easy to become complacent. So I had checklists for some things. I had checklists for, I'm about to go and run some serious whitewater. Okay, here's my list of things I need to do. I did not have a checklist for, I'm going to explore an abandoned lodge that I thought that I didn't realize I would find.
Yeah.
So I could promise you that I found one other set of outbuildings from that lodge a few days later. And honestly, my going through it looked like a first-person shooter game. Like, and of course, 12 gauge boat packed, angled out to sea so I could make a quick getaway, yelling, not spook the bear.
Yeah.
Cross-stepping, swiveling, scanning everything. And of course, there was no issue there. But now I had a procedure.
Well, part of your nightly routine every night that when you were setting camp was to set a bear perimeter, and I recall that from the book. And so, obviously, you're well versed in how to protect yourself and alert yourself to bears. And so, these are just some of the stories that people are going to find in this awesome book. I don't want to give away everything from the book, so we want people to read it. It's well worth it. But I would like to ask you, I want to go back to when you said that this was the last thought you had before you went under anesthesia was, I wonder if I'll be able to do that trip that I thought about all those years ago. And I think you maybe even said for 30 years, I've been thinking about this trip. So I wonder if you could take us back to the 30 years prior when you first sort of started thinking, why this particular trip?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. I guess I've always had an affinity for the outdoors, and who knows what really triggered that. I mean, one of my very first memories is waking up in a tent where my parents were camping with a small bit of land that they had bought on a lake. I have a sense memory of waking up in that tent, the log that I was sleeping against, and going and looking out the door. I don't think that's a made-up memory.
How old do you think you were then?
3, maybe.
Okay, awesome.
So it's right at that cusp where it might have happened. I believe it did happen in part because I've gone and done some research as to, I know where that property was, and I found photos of and looked at the map, and it's entirely congruent with my memory. So I think it's a true memory. But even if it isn't, the fact that I think it's one of my memories and it means that I created this memory or merged it together from other memories, shows how central it is to me. And I don't know why camping and canoeing is so central. Certainly, I grew up in Ontario. So in Ontario, you send your kids to canoe camp. And maybe that had something to do with it. It's easy to create a narrative post hoc, but it was something that really gelled with me. And then I began to read, and that's deadly, right? I was reading Bill Mason's Path of the Paddle. I was reading the accounts by Samuel Hearne, who traveled from Churchill to the mouth of the copper mine across this country. I started reading accounts of an explorer called J.B. Terrell. I started reading P.G. Downes. Later, I would read books by Oberholzer talking about traveling in this incredibly unique area. Right? It is the land of little sticks. It's that transition between forest and tundra. And in my early 20s, I planned a long solo trip to commemorate graduating from university and also to process, I didn't think of it this way at the time, but to process the death of a brother. And so what did I do? I ran to the wilderness to to create time to grieve and to create time to process it and to ultimately, although it wasn't explicitly thought of at the time, to heal. And I really do think it was helpful for me. I'm not recommending doing extended cross-Canada trips or cross-North America trips by yourself to process grief. It requires a very specific set of skills, which I happen to have. But that was my route. And while doing the research for that trip, I read about this land of little sticks, and I kind of brushed the very bottom part of it on that trip. But it just whetted a hunger for more. I wanted to see more of it. I wanted to go further north. And unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, the way life happens is that I then had to worry about jobs and kids and marriage and divorce and second marriage. And the whole adulting thing, which makes it difficult, or at least the way I had things set up, made it difficult to disappear for the entire summer. It's not something I regret, but it was difficult, right? Rearing kids is never easy. Divorce is, nobody ever goes through a divorce and goes, man, that was really fun. And it was so financially lucrative as well. I can't wait to go through this again and have to rebuild another time. And I'm not bitching and moaning, but it's adulting.
Yeah.
And so one thing that kept me going is during that time, I had the maps for this trip, more or less, right? There were parts I hadn't figured out yet, actually on the wall, right? On the wall leading down to my office, then later on walls of other apartments. And I'd walk by and I'd be able to like look at these maps and it would remind me that the North existed and that I just needed to get through the child rearing days. Because I didn't feel right about disappearing for a
Sure.
month or two
Sure.
with my kids were really young. Other people, I'm not passing judgment on people who do or who have that arrangement, usually with their spouse, but I didn't feel right about it.
Yeah.
So, and these maps, it was a strange progression from seeing these maps on the wall, reminding me that this is there. It's, I guess, my version of a vision board, to use a really woo-woo term. So my map vision board,
Yeah.
was on the wall, and eventually it only took 25 years of owning those maps to actually head out, and a near-death experience to finally kick my ass into gear and explore that.
Yeah, but this 40-day, 1,000-mile journey, like you didn't go from 0 to 60. I mean, there was a progression that happened.
Yeah, there's an amazing book called Wild by
Yeah.
Cheryl Strayed, who walked, basically the way she tells the story is she went from being this crazed drug addict to going to hike the Pacific Crest Trail,
Yeah,
with basically no experience and a pack that's way too big and boots that are way too small, and she survived. And I mean, first of all, that's insane, and that's part of the draw of the book, right? You're like, oh
Right,
my
right.
God, I can't believe she's doing this. No, don't do it. It's like the horror movie, right? I'm just going to go down to the pool house alone. No, don't do it.
Yeah.
I'm just going to go and hike the Pacific Crest Trail by myself. No, don't do
Yeah.
it. But she survives. And it's an amazing book. Again, just because it happened that way and makes a great story doesn't mean that that's the recommended approach.
Sure.
So yeah, I built up to it as best as I could. I mean, there's various components of a trip deep in the wilderness. Like one component is navigation. You really need to be good at navigation, especially in that terrain that stretches from the boundary waters up to, the Arctic, because it's so complicated. You'd think it's easy to find the exit of a lake. Well, make that lake 100 miles long, put 10,000 islands on that lake, put bays on that lake that stretch out for 30 miles. So if you go the wrong way, you're going to be going 30 miles one way and then turn around, come 30 miles back. In a motorboat, that's one thing. But when you're fighting the wind for every single paddle stroke, that's an entirely different thing. So just navigation is a skill. Whitewater paddling is a skill. Camping, from being able to cook or set up a tent in 50-kilometer-an-hour winds, is a skill. Bear procedures and dealing with bears is a skill. Basic first aid is a skill. Right? There are many different overlapping skills. And actually, one other skill I would say that keeps you sane in the wilderness and contributes significantly to your safety is a natural history. Learning the names of some of the species that you're seeing, understanding some of the ecology of the area. For one, it makes the experience richer. But for two, without a tremendous investment, it'll really begin helping you. You're looking for water. Oh, I noticed that we've got this species now as opposed to that other species. The ground must be getting wetter. As you're looking down to identify some reeds in the water, you notice that they're all bent over the same way. Oh, we've got current here. Maybe this is the exit of the lake. We can distinguish a larch tree from a spruce tree. If the larches are very soft and spindly, so if they're moving, it tells us there's a breeze. If the spruce are moving, it tells us there's a hell of a breeze, right? So that's only possible if you can identify those two different species of trees. It really helps prevent you from getting bored. It helps prevent you from feeling completely isolated. And it has some very concrete benefits to the sort of the survival aspect of it. And we haven't even talked about foraging. Oh, look at these berries. Is it okay to eat them? Well, that's a good question to find out before you go into a region.
Yeah. Even to the point where you get to write poems about these things, because I remember the spruce and the larch poem that you wrote about in the book. That was fun. Hey, so I want to ask you, as I'm listening to the story and I'm kind of thinking on this and just this idea of adversity, because this 1,000-mile journey was absolutely full of adversity. But you've had a lot of adversity just in your life. I mean, we talk about this illness that you had that you've recovered from. You've had loss of relatives. You've had a lot of adversity in your life, and some of it's unplanned. You didn't ask for it. But this trip is a trip that you planned. You knew what you were getting yourself into. You knew there'd be adversity. And it's just interesting to me because I've in all the different interviews that I've done with people, some people have unplanned adversities and some people go seek adversity because they know struggle is good for them. I'm just curious to get your thoughts because you've had both in your life, like unplanned versus planned adversity and how it sort of plays a role in your life overall.
Well, I think if you're going for planned adversity, part of planned adversity is knowing there's going to be unplanned events that happen to you in that. My friend Joost Kobush was just on Everest, and he didn't plan for there to be an earthquake while he was at, what was he at? 6,500 meters, and had to retreat off the mountain and call his expedition off for the year. So it's usually not on the top tier list of things to worry about if you're going to climb Everest, to pick that as an example again. Earthquake at massive elevation, but shit happens. That's just the way it goes. So in terms of seeking out adversity, though, yeah, it is something that I like to do. And it's something I really enjoy, the problem solving in real time where you have to use physical and mental skills together. So if you're running whitewater, that's a great example. You have to use your body and you may have to work really, really hard to try to make that eddy at the far side of the river. But if you just work really, really hard without the brain to harness it, then you're going to go fast, but you're going to go some random direction and you're going to swamp and have a yard sale in the whitewater. It's not really that different from deliberately doing something like jiu-jitsu, right? Which I really enjoy doing. I know you do taekwondo. And again, that's kind of using physical and mental together. I'm not a psychologist, but I think maybe in some ways I have a hypothesis. I am a scientist. So here's my hypothesis. My hypothesis is that it's much easier to deal with adversity if there's some kind of physical component to it, because at least you can harness your fight or flight instinct. But I really have to make it across this bloody river to that eddy, or I'm going to get washed down into that maelstrom and flip and drown. So I have stress. I'm having a fight or flight reflex, but I can use that adrenaline to paddle across the river. It's a little bit different from your boss saying, Scott, we absolutely need that 400-page report on whatever it is, on how much wood could a woodchuck chuck, if a woodchuck could chuck wood, by tomorrow morning. And we need you to consider all the implications for every county in the state, or you're fired, and we're going to sue you. Okay, so that's a lot of stress, but now your response has to be to type faster.
Right.
And to think harder. So in a genuinely stressful, there will be genuine consequences if you don't produce this bloody report. So I think having the physical outlet for the perhaps self-created physical and emotional stress is a very different thing from just stress in general. Firefighting would be the same way, really.
Hey everyone, it's Scott here. This podcast is a passion project for me because I absolutely love adventure. And it's thanks to the effort of my residential real estate team here in Charlotte, North Carolina, that many of you know as the W Realty Group, that this podcast gets funded. This awesome group of people have unmatched levels of competence and caring for our clients. If you know of anyone looking to buy or sell a home, Our team serves the Charlotte, North Carolina market, but we can also help you find an agent anywhere throughout the US or Canada through our highly connected network. When you support our real estate business, you are also supporting this podcast. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your referrals. Well, and that was certainly a comment that I wanted to make, because it seems like you've really gotten in touch with who you are and what your gifts are, because it's like so aligned. Like, you love going out into the wilderness in these adverse situations, but like as a career, you're a firefighter. Like, this is what you do. Your gift.
You could argue it's
yeah.
Maybe it's just polishing up and retroactively explaining a certain amount of adrenaline junkiehood. There's certainly some of that. I think as I've gotten older and seen the consequences of adventure gone bad, whether that's a car wrapped around a bridge abutment driven by inevitably young men who thought they were going to live forever, losing brothers, two of my brothers, both of whom thought they were going to live forever, or seeing, things go really bad in martial arts competition. Or I've not done too much MMA, but watching fighters, the before and after of getting hit in the head for years and years, watching their mental decline. I think that's tempered me. As we get older, we see more and more examples of people screwing up. And although we can process stuff statistically, if you do contact sports would involve contact of the head, CTE is a real risk, and 12% of boxers experience cognitive decline and whatever. It's very different when you see a friend go through it, right? So the risk to reward balancing has changed, but there's still that adrenaline urge. And in my case, there's a certain thrill that comes from managing risk, not just taking risk, but managing it, and especially managing it successfully most times.
And risk assessment is a huge part of your book. But you also, you talked about like the physical aspect of the adversity. And I just was kind of thinking on that as you were talking, because it almost seems like the physical adversity allows you to fight back. Like, you can physically fight back. Like, you have a sense of control where you can use your body, you can use your mind to like go against that adversity and overcome it. Whereas like certain adversities is just like, the loss of a family member, you can't do anything about.
Yeah. When you have either control or the illusion of control, it's very different. For example, I hate roller coasters. I can't stand roller coasters.
I love that.
But if you put a wheel, say you put a little wheel,
it makes so much sense
on the roller coaster front, and you allowed me to think that I'm driving the roller coaster, I'd probably love it. Ooh, look at me, I'm controlling it.
Yeah.
No, you're not.
It makes so much sense. I love it. Hey, so I want to pivot for a minute because again, like perseverance, like weather, wildlife, wildfires. We didn't even get into that. That's in the book. People are going to get that. But I'm curious, like, as you're out there, a couple of things. Like, number one, you're out there for 40 days all by yourself. And I'm just curious, like, if there were moments of like peace and stillness and awe that you experienced.
Yes, absolutely. And it honestly doesn't take very much of that to be hooked for life. In the last 10 days of the trip that I had, making my way down from Newton Lake down to Hudson Bay, which is a giant body of salt water that's connected up to the Arctic Ocean, was some of the worst weather I've ever had on a trip. We're talking horizontal rain. We're talking just above freezing temperatures in August. One frost in the mornings. Anytime the wind wasn't howling, just ridiculous black flies, but the wind was howling most of the time. And it was an incredibly difficult time. And that can really begin to grind down on you. But in the middle of all that, there were a couple of days that were just spectacular. We're talking blue skies, tailwind, reasonably warm, no bugs for some reason, and then catching the caribou migration. So caribou, like very large deer, basically half deer, half moose, if you want to use an incorrect genetic analogy. And they travel in these large packs and they migrate. They'll spend the summers out on the tundra, and in the winter they come back down into the somewhat more sheltered, somewhat less bitterly cold areas. And I've caught the caribou migration twice in my life. In all my trips in the north, in all the summers I've spent up there, I've caught it. I've seen isolated caribou, but this hundreds of caribou moving across the landscape, I've caught it twice. And something like that is an absolutely magical experience. And that's something that as you're going through it, you're actively trying to engrave it into your memory. You're like telling your synapses to form, make this a permanent memory. Because someday when you're old and broken, you want to be able to like look back at a picture from that day and go, oh yeah, I remember that day. There were certainly other moments, even something as simple as figuring out a way to get through a rapid or around a rapid without having to go through the giant rigmarole of having to unpack your entire bloody boat, carry it through really, really difficult terrain. It kind of makes you feel like you've pulled one over on the situation. It's again, what it is, it's satisfaction with problem solving. When my crew in the fire department goes to a fire and we do a good job and we save the building or we save the dog or whatever it is, and none of us get hurt, there's this amazing boost in morale, right? Because it's team building, it's working together as a team in the face of adversity, which always helps bond a team. But it's also, hey, we figured it out. We solved that problem. And in my case, I really like it when training corresponds to what you do in real life. So if I'm training how to get out of an armbar and then I pull that off on the jiu-jitsu mat, I get out of that armbar, that feels great to me because I trained to do it and then I did it. If we train how to deal with a specific chemical spill in the fire department, and then we go and deal with that chemical, man, that feels pretty cool to me because we trained to do it and then we did it.
Yeah.
When I'm prepare for a paddling trip by going and doing a whole bunch of whitewater paddling in little tiny whitewater boats, and I figure out how to do, I don't know, a offside lean eddy turn in a canoe, and then I get to a place on a trip where that's the right move. And it's a bit of a risky move, but there's times you can do it safely. And that ends up being the right move. That creates this connection between I trained to do this and then I did it. And it's this little swell. So I don't know if that's awe. Maybe it's awe of how awesome I am. But
no,
yeah.
it's cool. It's a cool little, I trained for it and then I did it. That's really cool. And then the awe piece that you said that I really liked was this idea of actively trying to ingrain the memory so that they'll like hanging on to it. And to me, like, I feel like that's a really good description of being fully present. Like I'm so present in this moment that I really want to ingrain this experience in my memory so that I never forget it. I feel like that's such a great way to put awe.
It sounds like what you're referring to is achieving a state of flow. And I certainly think that is, I don't think you reach flow if you're doing something that requires no challenge. You reach flow when you're responding well to challenge.
Yeah.
And certainly the mental state of slipping into that and being present in the moment is very addictive and very gratifying.
Yeah. Stephan, you said the word satisfying. I don't want to give too much away, but in the book you talk about the difference between satisfaction and happiness. And I wonder if you could just touch on that real quick.
So a lot of people navigate by happiness, right? I want to be happy. And I think that's a good thing. I don't think there's anything wrong with being happy. I want to be happy too. But I think there's a difference between happiness and satisfaction. Satisfaction is more retroactive. Like you look back at something and you're like, yeah, that's something worth being proud of. That's usually it involves some kind of challenge that you've overcome. And if you're navigating your life just by being happy, well, then really you should just be eating your favorite treat all day long. If Haagen-Dazs makes you happy, it certainly makes me happy. I have a sweet tooth. I'll admit it. But I would suggest that if eating a container of Haagen-Dazs in the bathtub makes me happy, that I probably shouldn't expand this to say, okay, if that makes me 1 unit happy, I should have 10 units of Haagen-Dazs a day in the bathtub, right? That is unlikely to lead to anything good in the long run.
Yeah.
So I think there are times when you're slogging away, it's hard to see that good things are going to come out of whatever it is that you're doing. It's that darkest before the dawn phase. And if it's a worthwhile goal that you're working towards, and if you can find some way to pull it off, just recognize that at the other end of that, there might be a lot of satisfaction.
Yeah.
And this realization came out of after the trip, after I got home, looking like a homeless person, still being gaunt and partially shaven and wearing clothes I had bought, the last set of pants on the rack in this tiny little native village on Hudson Bay. I was eating dinner with a couple of friends, and I was telling them the stories of what had happened and what I had done, and they were pretty interested. And at the end, the wife of that couple turns to me and goes, "But that's a really cool story, but did it make you happy?" And I was really confused by this. It seemed entirely beside the point. And eventually I managed to articulate that there had been moments of happiness, but happiness was the wrong question. The real question was there satisfaction? And yeah, there was a lot of satisfaction. And I think that's a much more important North Star to have than happiness.
Well, you know what's so cool? I think you put it another way, maybe intentionally, maybe not intentionally, when you said, I trained for it and then I did it.
Mm.
Because it's like you trained for this thing and then you went and did it. And the satisfaction comes in knowing you had trained and you did the work and now you were able to pull it off. Like you prepared, you showed up, you did it, you succeeded. And it's like satisfaction about the whole journey.
I prepared as best as I could. I was pretty heavily limited. I did not do the perfect preparation for this because I went into that journey with two pretty badly buggered shoulders.
Yeah.
Right. I'd hurt one doing jiu-jitsu and I'd hurt another playing with my 13-year-old kid. And they were fairly severe injuries. So that was part of my thinking, like, there's no guarantee that this is going to work. And I would suggest that if you only ever steer for things that you know are going to work, then you probably don't have your sights set high enough. There should be an element of a chance of failure in at least some of your activities. Now, hopefully failure is the non-fatal kind. Hopefully you've got, let's say, again, we're climbing a mountain. Failure would be, oh, I've got to turn around and go down, as opposed to falling off some cliff and dying. They're both failure. One is to be commended. The other is unfortunate. Going into it, for example, my cardio was on point because I could control that. I could do hours and hours and hours of cardio, and that's heart and lungs were at least not part of the heart, lungs, and legs weren't part of the limiting factors.
Yeah.
But that trip also taught me a lot about physical preparation for activities. And I've put a lot of those lessons to work. I've done a few expeditions since, and I really learned a lot about how to do that more efficiently and more effectively.
It's such a great story. So many lessons. I really appreciate you sharing all this. The book, Perseverance, what do you most want people to take away from this book?
I have to preface it by saying my path is not your path. My path to dealing with loss, my path to dealing with grief, and ultimately then my path to dealing with my own near mortality took me into the subarctic. But again, that's an area that had special meaning for me.
Mm-hmm.
And it was it was an area that I more or less had the skills to do well in and succeed. So my path is not your path, but I've dealt with a fair amount of death, both in my own family, my siblings, my own brush with death, and my time as a firefighter, right? I see all kinds of misadventure and disaster, and they are tragedies. It's undeniable. I don't mean to minimize it in any way. But when something like that happens, or you witness something like that, it's also a gift. It's a reminder that life is short. Every person that you know passes away or has a brush with death is giving you a gift, and they're like, hey, dum-dum, life is short. You don't know how many days you have left. Are you going to die at 80? Hopefully. Are you going to die tomorrow? You don't know. So it's a memento mori, this idea of remember you're going to die. And if you can reframe those tragedies around you as a gift, a tragic gift, but a gift, and use that to kick you in your ass to go and do the things or achieve the things you've always wanted to achieve anyway. I think it's a way to reframe an issue. Maybe it'll take you into the distant Canadian North with 1 billion of your best blackfly friends. Or maybe it'll take you on the Camino de Santiago. Or maybe it'll take you to, I don't know, go visit the churches carved into the rock in Cappadocia, or whatever it is. I tend to use outdoor examples because that's where my brain is. But if your life dream is to, I don't know, I'm going to pick something, to do Fashion Week in Paris, to pick a ludicrous example. Please tell me there's a Fashion Week in Paris. I'm pretty sure that Paris is
I don't know, but
okay.
I'm tracking with you. I'm loving the story.
Well, we're on a podcast, therefore we are experts in everything.
Right.
And we're now experts in Fashion Week in Paris.
Right.
If that's your absolute life dream, what do you need to do to achieve that life goal? Because you don't know when you're going to die.
I love it. Thank you. How can people get a copy of the book or connect with you or follow your journey?
The book is pretty much available everywhere. It's currently available hardcover, Kindle, and audiobook. So Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Indigo, bookstore.com. Just for fun, I went to the tiny independent bookstore that's around the corner. I went to their website, typed it in, and yeah, guess what? They can get it too.
Writing a book is a huge voyage in itself, and that I'm sure is full of adversity. So huge congrats to you on that. When people see this story and they understand the epic nature of what you did, 1,000 miles, 40 days alone in the subarctic, like this is an epic story, like encounters with bears in lodges. I mean, this is movie stuff. And at some point, Hollywood's going to make a movie about you. And so what I want to know is, when they do, who's going to be the Hollywood actor that's going to play you in this epic adventure?
Are there any constraints on this choice?
No.
Well, we'd either have to go Daniel Craig, because he did such a good job.
Nice. I love it. Daniel Craig. Oh, man. Perfect.
Or maybe Clint Eastwood, although his brush with canoeing in Deliverance was a little bit more violent and ended a little bit worse for some people than it ended for me. So I'll go with Daniel Craig on that basis.
I love it. Daniel Craig sounds good. What's your movie going to be called?
Well, my publisher would probably want it to be called Perseverance, Life and Death in the Subarctic. But I think I would have to go with, what's that phrase? Too tough to die, too dumb to quit.
Too dumb to quit. I love it. Yeah. Oh, man. What an epic story. Again, congratulations on the book. Stephan, thank you so much for being here today and for spending some time with me. And for those listening, I hope you have been inspired today as much as I have. Hope Stephan's story has encouraged you to listen to the voice inside that calls you to adventure, because we want to hear your story next. If you have a story to tell or just need a nudge to create one, please send me an email. We'd also appreciate it if you'd help us spread the word by leaving a review and sharing or tagging Inspire Campfire in your social media. And until next time, I want to encourage you to get outside. Thanks for listening. Stephan, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much.